think it was your affinity for the French and also your own knowledge of French that also helped you with the Heims?
It certainly didn't hurt.
Because he lived how long in France?
Well, in France and Paris, most of his adult life. He went over, came back, went over and stayed. That, you know, it was much easier to research and communicate with people in France.
Yeah.
And
you seemed like a natural, you know.
Well, and the papers were at Amistad, which is part of Tulane, which is my alma mater, so that was easy also, and it gave me an excuse to go to New Orleans. But Chester just has fascinated me from the moment I picked up his first book, and I didn't know much about him. What I was able to find about him was so odd and so contradictory.
Well, he had a very difficult and unusual life. And of course, being a black man in America in his time and trying to be a creative artist was not easy. I mean, the French were far more sympathetic, and I'm sure that's why he went and stayed there in the same way that Josephine Baker or you know, whatever. Plus, the French also have that great noir tradition. Didn't David Goodis kind of spend a huge amount of his...
He's still hugely popular there.
Right, but I mean, didn't he actually live in France?
I don't think so.
Really? Because I know he stayed published in French when he was no longer here.
The books have maintained their visibility there in a way they never had here, as Horace McCoy has, who's completely forgotten here and is still much revered by the French.
I also think it must be a little bit difficult to be banging around on someone else's creative head rather than your own.
It's a very strange experience.
Yeah.
But, you know, when I was doing the translation to Cano, for instance, I said, you know, it's hard enough to write your own books, but I'm writing this book with Raymond looking over my left shoulder going, no. So with Chester, I more or less tried to get into Chester's head the same way I would get into one of my characters' heads, and actually look out from Chester at the world, which is what I do when I'm writing. And I do have affinities with Chester, but, you know, I'm not an African American, and I didn't grow up in the kind of family Chester did, and I didn't have the hardships, specific hardships he had. I was not in prison for 7.5 years, and so on. But the job of any writer of fiction is to try to get out of his or her own head and to get into other heads and look out those people's eyes. So when I was doing a biography, that's a lot of what I was doing. And yeah, it's a jump, but it's not that much bigger a jump than creating a character like the protagonist of Drive or Turner or Lou Griffin, who's also African American. That's just what we do as writers. It's giving all the variant interpretations of the historical sequences and the historical events. That was the really hard part of the biography, because there would be an incident in which, you know, Chester was confronted by Herb Gentry or whatever, and there would be 8, 10 different versions depending on who you talk to. It was, you know, Rashomon all over again, and trying to give equal balance to those and sort all that out. That was the slog work of doing the biography.
Yeah, but not only that, ultimately you had to be true to Chester's voice and not your own. And at least if it's your own character, you can steer it, or, you know, you can do what you want. But in fact, with Chester, ultimately he, you know, had to look over your shoulder and dictate it.
And
so
he was a very...
There's a restriction there that you don't experience in your own.
That's with the translating.
Yeah.
There is a restriction, but, you know, I felt free to give my interpretation, to sort of say this is how the world looks when I try to climb inside Chester's head, and season that with what other people said, and with as close as I could tell the narrative of actually what happened. And I think I got Chester, but I'm really not sure. He was a remarkably complex person.
Well, I think that yours is the definitive Heims for now, and you know, if someone else eventually comes along and writes another, then that's the way it is.
As it should be.
Yeah, but you know, I think it's a brilliant work and deserved all the great recognition that it got. You also got a surprisingly lucrative contract for a book like that, so
Yes.
that was gratifying too. Okay, so we've done poet, musician, translator, biographer. You are currently a columnist for the Boston Globe.
Yes, I am.
And you teach. You're commuting to LA from Phoenix. So
That's why I look so bleary-eyed right now.
I thought it was the flu.
That too.
But I know you're a wonderful teacher. I know at least one of my staff actually studies in your classes. So all of that, but I came to your work in your novels, your crime novels about Lou Griffin. And interestingly, and I was thinking about Chester, because I think the Lou Griffin are so real, and I've loved them so. I was sure before we met that you were an African American, and I was greatly shocked when you showed up for our first meeting, and I thought, oh wait. Do you think that growing up in New Orleans, or at least going to Tulane and all, gives you a little more affinity maybe? Because that's a hard thing to do, to get inside somebody else's skin if it's different.
Well, New Orleans to some extent, but I grew up in the rural South, and in Arkansas, and where I lived, it was all a jumble because we didn't have money.
Right.
We lived with everybody else who didn't have money, and I actually played chiefly with African American children until I remember it as being 10, but I'm not really sure, and my parents told me that I couldn't play with my friend Sonny or whatever his name was anymore, and I couldn't understand why, because that's what I'd done all my life. We lived pretty much outside town, and there wasn't anyone else to play with. And I actually reversed that in the Lou Griffin novels. But so you know, I grew up in the rural South, and however you read Faulkner and however you read the other things, there certainly is a connection to African Americans when you grow up especially in the rural South, which doesn't happen anywhere else. And the attraction of New Orleans for me was the primacy of African American music forms there. And when I was first there as a student, the races were mingling very easily and very naturally. There were incidences later on, before I went back to live in New Orleans, that sadly sent the races off on their separate paths, and there wasn't that kind of mixing there was before. Which I really regret, but then there's much about New Orleans to regret these days.
Well, there certainly is. You know, it's interesting that your timing finishing up the Lou Griffin novels actually happened before Katrina, and in a way, you know, you've created, well, not in a way, you have created a body of work that will allow us to revisit New Orleans as it can never be again.
It will never be again, exactly. I was, shortly after Katrina, I went to Italy for a huge literary festival Letteratura, and before I even left, I started having a lot of emails from newspapers abroad wanting me to comment or write about New Orleans, about Katrina. I had to refuse because I was finishing a book and getting ready to go to Italy. But in Italy, I finally had to stop talking about New Orleans because I went through the first long interviews in Europe are quite different from here. They tend to go on a long time.
Right.
They're very literate. The people actually have read things and have a lot of good questions. So the first interview was about 2 hours long, and it was mostly about New Orleans. So thereafter, I had to create a moratorium and say, I've already talked about New Orleans. But the question would always come up from the audience, and it would be, what is New Orleans going to be like? I have no idea. None of us do.
Right.
And the other question would be, are you going to write about New Orleans again? And again, I would have to say, I don't have any idea. I don't know. I cannot imagine, you know, I make a living imagining things, but I really have difficulty imagining what New Orleans is going to look like, and certainly have a lot of difficulty imagining what it's going to feel like.
Well, it certainly can't feel like
no,
it
will
did
never
before.
be the same. And give it some years and see. I don't know. I am very pleased that New Orleans is in the books, and one of the really impelling factors in writing the books was I felt that very few people had actually captured New Orleans, the New Orleans that I knew, the entire city, not just the one little section of the city, the Garden District or the French Quarter.
Right.
And I purposefully tried to depict the variety and the variegations of the city, and and actually visualize the city for the readers the way I saw it when I was out walking around it. And so I'm very pleased.
Well,